Hello and welcome to Church at Home with Rachel for Thursday the 28th of July. As some of you might be aware, if you've been paying attention to what I've been talking to, or if you've been paying attention to the news here in North America, you will know that this has been a busy week for the church and for faith and our conversations about such. Marjorie Taylor Greene has announced that she is a Christian nationalist, and that has nothing to do with Canada, except eventually it will, just because the trickle-down economics may not actually happen, how it may not work. However, trickle-up politics it trickles across the border. So that's a thing, Christian nationalism. We are also dealing with another thing, the papal apology with Pope Francis here in Canada. And we are dealing with all of our Canadian bishops and American bishops and most bishops from the Anglican Communion around the world gathered at Lambeth Palace in England for 10 days to talk about the church, to pray together, to study the Bible. And so I'm going to chat about those three things and what they might mean, in my mind anyway. But before I begin, I would just like to share with you, this morning as I was doing my daily office, I was directed to read from the first book of Samuel, chapter 3, verses 1 to 12. And it talks about Samuel's call. Eli was the priest, and it says that his eyesight had begun to grow dim, so he could not see, and he was laying down in his room. And Samuel is the boy, was laying in the temple, and he heard someone's voice, and he thought it was Eli, so he went to Eli and said, here you are, here I am, you called me. And Eli said, well, no, I didn't call you. So Samuel went back, and this happened 3 times, and finally Eli said to him, Samuel, this is not me calling, this is God. And it says here that now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. So it's not a surprise that Eli and Samuel don't realize that God is speaking directly to Samuel. A new thing is happening. God is breaking into history, and he's speaking to a child. He's speaking to his new prophet, Samuel. And I think that's important. Just hang on to that. In the States, I do believe there is a false prophet called Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is talking about Christian nationalism and how that is the true way of the American people. That the Christian nationalism needs to be the rhetoric of the people. And I am not going to say faith, because I don't believe Christian nationalism is a faith. I think it is a heresy. It is unorthodox, and it is not right. There is no way that in today's world we can say to a vast group of people who have come together and loaned their expertise and their cultures and their wisdom into this thing. I think in the States it's called the melting pot. In Canada we refer to it as mosaic. 2 totally different things, topic for another day. But either way, that coming together of all these different cultures and religions and beliefs and abilities to work with each other, to share the gifts of those things, the best of those things, and the idea of making a country one under one God with that particular bent. I mean, what she's talking about pretty much eliminates Episcopalians from being part of that national body, because that's just not what, as Anglicans, we believe. So there's that heresy being thrown out there it's openly talked about now. It has been hiding and sneaking in and playing peekaboo with our society for a couple of years now, in particular, and now it's right out there. No more playing hide and seek. It's been named, and now we'll see what happens. The debates will happen. God bless her, because she needs God's blessings, because she is so wrong. And then we also have, at the same time, we have the fact that Pope Francis is in Canada to apologize to the Indigenous peoples, in particular to those who were lived under the horrible regime of residential schools, and their children and grandchildren, their offspring, and the damage, the multi-generational damage that was done in the residential schools by all the churches. Now, there has been some calling out here, like now that the Pope has apologized, we're waiting for the other churches. Well, The other churches have already apologized. I might be wrong, but I do believe that Archbishop Michael Piers apologized on behalf of the Anglican Church way back in 1993. So we're talking almost 30 years ago. That the Anglican Church in Canada has been walking this very slow, not always steady journey toward truth and reconciliation. And we are working toward that. Now, there are lots of people having lots of opinions about the apology. Everything I've heard about the apology itself that happened on Monday was very positive. Maybe I'm just reading the wrong blogs, but however, there's been quite a bit of criticism about the open-air Mass that was held in Edmonton on Tuesday. The Pope, he celebrated the Mass in Latin. His sermon did not go where it needed to go. He fell short of X, Y, and Z, things that people were hoping for and seeing. I am not going to say that people are wrong. I am going to ask that maybe we widen our perspective just a moment. This may not be popular, but that's okay. We hoped, all Christians I hope, but all certainly Anglicans in Canada hoped and prayed that the bishop or the Pope would come to Canada and apologize. After a delegation of Indigenous peoples from Canada went to the Vatican in, I believe it was February of this year, there was a sense of the beginning of a healing process with the Roman Catholic Church. And this was the next step, that if the Pope could come and apologize on Canadian soil, on the Indigenous soil upon which those residential schools were created, that would then be the next step of many, many steps in a process of truth and reconciliation and healing. One of the gifts that an Indigenous priest in my diocese in Edmonton shared was that, and I know I've heard this in other places and times, is it took 7 generations of persecution, of racism, of anti-culturalism, and culturalism, I just made that up, it's not the right word, but you know what I mean. It took 7 generations to break the Indigenous community. It's going to take 7 generations to build relationships. We can't rebuild them. There's nothing to rebuild, to build from scratch new relationships in which trust and healing and reconciliation can happen. For those people who were expecting the Pope to come and do something that they have been crying for at least 10 years for the Pope to do, which was to come and to apologize, it took 10 years for the apology to happen on this soil, to happen at all, let alone on this soil. How is it that people were expecting that 2,000 years of history of the Pope celebrating the Mass in Latin, of the Pope being surrounded by male priests at the altar, by the Pope preaching, and maybe not truly understanding the power of that moment or the effect his words could have, when he is not Canadian, has not lived in the Canadian context, has not had lengthy and continuous conversation or even presence, ministry of presence with the Indigenous peoples. He came as the Pope in his own context and offered what he was available to him in his context. He is not Indigenous. He hasn't even heard, he hasn't even scratched the surface of hearing the stories of the Indigenous peoples who suffered at the hands of the Roman Catholics, the Presbyterians, the Anglican United, all the different peoples, the government people who ran those residential schools. He doesn't have that information. He may not ever live long enough to get all that information. And I think we need to cut him some slack there and recognize the context within which that Mass happened. He brought Rome to Canada. He wasn't coming to Canada to become Indigenous. He wasn't coming to Canada to eliminate or pretend that his Roman Catholic presence as the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church in the whole world didn't exist. And for those And to be quite frank, the conversations I've read, there haven't been many, but the ones that have been most disappointed were not even Roman Catholic people. Quite a few priests, Anglican priests, were concerned. It wasn't as Anglicans, it wasn't our Mass. Yes, Anglicans were invited to participate, to be present, to witness. The world was invited to witness through media. But this was a Roman Catholic Mass for Roman Catholic peoples, in specific Roman Catholic indigenous peoples and other indigenous peoples to whom the apology was offered. We are bystanders. We are observers. We are people who don't have the right to claim. We don't have the right to claim that we understand or can do the work of indigenous peoples in bringing about reconciliation and truth. We have to claim our own role in that. Neither do we, if we are not Roman Catholic, have the right to claim that this is what the Pope should do. What the Pope did out of the integrity and the essence of who he is as the Pope. And we need to grapple with that, and we need to let ourselves understand what that might mean. And I think we need to understand that what took 7 generations to break will take 7 generations to heal. And 1 week, 48 hours, 1 day of apologies and the next day a Mass, that massive gap isn't going to be bridged in that time, nor should we really have expected it. And to be quite frank, the only people who have the right to say that was not enough, or he did not go far enough, is the indigenous peoples. They have the right to say that because they are the ones who truly are invited then to do this work of continuing to walk with the Pope, the cardinals, the bishops, and the Roman Catholic Church to bring that healing, just as indigenous peoples have been walking with the Anglican Church for these many years to bring about that healing. And so I guess I'm asking people's patience and forgiveness that the Pope was not able to do what you wanted him to do. Let's focus on what is important. The Pope has made the first of many steps. We need to be praying and encouraging and hoping and pushing toward the fact that these steps will not stop, that they are just the beginning of a long journey between the Roman Catholic Church and the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, that they might come together in truth and reconciliation, in forgiveness and healing. But it's their work that needs to be done, not mine, not ours. The other thing that's happening is Lambeth Conference. And as I said a couple of days ago, there was the Call to Dignity that had a statement about LGBTQ two-spirited plus peoples and what the real marriage is and things like that. That did get changed. The call was reworded, and if you haven't seen it, I really do encourage you to watch the video, the BBC interview of Bishop Kevin Robertson, from a suffragan bishop from the Diocese of Toronto, and a priest out of England who works with the Lambeth Conference. It was on BBC, and I've put it on my Twitter account. So if you want to check it out there, you can. I have no idea how to get the link onto YouTube, so please forgive me. But it was a very good interview, I think, in which both sides of the situation, where both sides of the story were shared. I think his name, the priest, was Ian Paul, and he shared, the truth that the mass majority of Anglicans in the world are coming from South America and Africa and Asia, and they are more conservative in nature, and they believe strongly that marriage should be between a man and a woman. Okay, I understand that. There are lots of Anglicans, not nearly as many, but there are lots of Anglicans in the North American context, and I believe in the European and British context too, some of them, who really do believe that this is not an issue anymore, nor should it be, and hence we have worked toward making room and removing barriers to those people who happen to be LGBTQ two-spirited plus, rather than and leaving barriers up, we have been trying to eliminate them in most dioceses in this country. Not all, and the same thing in the United States, not all in agreement. But again, we are trying to learn how to dialogue with one another. And what I believe is happening is kind of like Peter and Paul. You might recall that in the Acts of the Apostles, Peter and Paul sort of kept going head to head because Peter was a big believer that Jesus came for those people who he spoke to. Yeah, maybe some Gentiles, but definitely the Jews. And Peter was really focused on that the gospel should be shared with the Jewish peoples, that those peoples that Jesus actually worked with. And Paul came along with a whole other thing, saying, no, 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 I need to go tell the Romans and the Thessalonians and the Colossians and the Corinthians. They all have the opportunity to believe. I believe I was given divine knowledge, divine permission to reach out and talk to these people. And I think, Peter, that you're wrong. You should be reaching out to everybody. It's not just for them. And Peter yelling back at Paul. I can just imagine the two of them having fights, strong-willed, strong-minded men, yelling at Paul saying, you're wrong. This is not what Jesus wanted. This is not what he intended. And then remember what happens. We already know that before Paul recognized that he should be celebrating Jesus, he had to have his own heart changed. He was blinded, and then the scales fell from his eyes, and he understood that Jesus was calling him to a new thing. Peter also had a revelation. He had a dream in which the Lord lowered a sheet that had many different animals on it, animals that the Jewish peoples would think were unclean. And he told them, what you have known before has changed. And Peter, too, changed his opinion. Didn't change them completely. They still worked in two separate ways. But they recognized that while they had differences of opinion, they believed in the same Jesus. And that they were called to reach out to different people with the same kernel of the gospel was the same. But the way it was expressed was a little bit different. The way they reached out to people was a little bit different. And I'm really wondering if that is not what the Lambeth Conference is right now all about, is looking at the Peters and Pauls and acknowledging that I may not understand the revelation that Jesus has given to you, but I can acknowledge that you believe you have been given that revelation. And I will not interfere with you as you preach the good news of Jesus Christ to those people that God has called you to serve. And you will not interfere with me as I reach out and preach the gospel to those people that Jesus has called me to serve in my context. I really do believe that this is a time for the church to be on its knees. Not on its knees in a way of submission, that we have been brought low, as I believe that is what Marjorie Taylor Greene is trying to say, is that everything else should be brought low because of this which should be held up high. I do not believe that the church should be begging or groveling on its knees, but I do think the church should be on its knees in prayer, with our arms lifted up in thanksgiving to God for the many various revelations God has given to us in our own context, that we might serve the people we find ourselves with, those people in whose community we serve, because they are different than the community down the road or the community across the pond, community in a different continent. God has given us the gifts to share the good news, to do the good work of serving Jesus through people, of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the imprisoned and the sick, preaching the good news in our context. And our context is so very different than that of Africa or South America or England or Croatia or Ukraine or Russia or anywhere else. The church needs to be on its knees, not in humiliation and submission, but because when we are on our knees, we are the most humble. And we are most able to recognize that the one who is most powerful is the Lord God. And through his Son, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, that is how we are empowered to come up off our knees and to go out and serve the Lord in our context, in the ways that God has called us to serve. It is not an either or. It is a both and. We must stand up in this context and speak out against Christian nationalism. But we must also stand up and celebrate the movement forward in truth and peace and reconciliation as the Pope comes and begins a new chapter in the relationship of Indigenous peoples with the Catholic Church, indeed between Indigenous peoples and the Christian Church. And as we begin a new possibility with the Lambeth Conference, as they move into conversation that will hopefully not look like either or, but again, might be both and. But all of that, in all of our contexts, must begin with the church on its knees, in humble adoration, acknowledging that we are not God, thanks be to God, acknowledging that we are humble and not humiliated, but humbly kneeling before our Lord, waiting for God to raise us up that we might go out and raise up others in our context with the message, the unique message that God has given to us to serve in our communities. On our knees, in humble adoration, the church must bow and then rise up. Have a wonderful day, and God bless you.